Okay, my presentation today will be on biblical governing. I will be pointing out three major things a governing body does. Within this presentation, we will see the differences between governing as God intends and governing in ways that are not satisfactory to the Lord. So to be completely cliche, I will begin with a definition. We're going to do the definition of the word to govern, which is to govern is to conduct the policy, actions, and affairs of a state, organization, or people. With this in mind, we can see a government directly from the beginning of Genesis. If you look at the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, we're just going to read the first few sentences. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. So God's government and authority over the earth is decided the moment that he creates. God says what is to take place, and it happens. God is not only able to create with his words, but he also puts his creation into submission through his words. God separates the land from the sea later, and he separates the light from the darkness here. So God is putting his creation into submission. While this example may seem silly to include in such a short presentation on government, just for such a short presentation on government, it's quite necessary, and we can draw some conclusions out of this also. Number one, a governing body needs someone or something to govern. God creates a world. Before God created the world, there was nothing for him to govern other than the Trinity, but that's, never mind. Number two, a governing body needs a people who will be in submission to him. God creates the earth, and the earth is in submission to him. And number three, a governing body creates a society that they think is good. And we see this throughout all of Genesis chapter 1, where we see God say that his creation is good. And we will be using these three conclusions to compare against other governments that we see throughout the Bible. So our second example will be in Genesis chapter 3, where we'll see the family unit. When the fall of man takes place in Genesis 3, we see God establish the first form of a human government within the family structure. While God establishes this government as a result of sin, it is later used in Paul's writings also, so we know that it's quite important. In this account, we see God place a man as the governing leader over his wife. When we look at him within the context of the conclusions we made of God's governing, we see that it holds to our conclusions. Number one, a husband will govern his wife and children, and that's similar to a governing body needs someone or something to govern. Number two, a governing body needs a people group who will be in submission to them, and we see this through the wife who will submit to her husband. And number three, a governing body creates a society that they think is good, which the husband will do what he thinks is best for his family. Now, this is how it's supposed to look. And we know that if a man is in submission to Christ, as Paul says, and the woman is in submission to man, then the family structure is going to work well. But what could happen is within different families, we see different situations which do not always look like this. Sometimes the woman rules over her husband, and this leaves the husband feeling empty and disrespected within the realm of family. We can also see a man who governs his family, or attempts rather, while his wife and or children are not in submission to him. This can take place through rebellion or genuine disrespect for whatever reason. We can also see a man who does what he thinks is good, which does not coincide with what is proper in the eyes of the Lord, which isn't good, even though it is good what he thinks is good. Now, our third example will be through God's established government in Israel. In Deuteronomy 17, we see two forms of government which the Lord gives us examples of. First, he gives how a judicial system of government in Israel will work, and then how a monarchical system will work, just in the next chapter. So if you want to go to Deuteronomy 17, I'm just going to read a couple verses. Starting with verse 8, if any case arises requiring decision between one kind of homicide and another, one kind of legal right and another, or one kind of assault and another, any case within your towns that is too difficult for you, then you shall arise and go up to the place that the Lord your God will choose, And you shall come to the Levitical priests and to the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall consult them, and they shall declare to you the decision. Then you shall do according to what they declare to you from that place that the Lord will choose. And you shall be careful to do according to all that they direct you. According to the instructions that they give you, and according to the decisions which they pronounce to you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the verdict that they declare to you, either to the right hand or to the left. The man who acts presumptuously by not obeying the priest, who stands to minister there before the Lord your God or the judge, that man shall die. So you shall purge the evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear and not act presumptuously again. So again, if we compare it to the conclusions that we drew from God's governing over the earth, we can see that the people who God puts a judge or king over is the Israelites. Number 2, this people will be in submission to the king or judge. And number 3, this judge will do what he believes is right. Again, we can see the same conclusions drawn that we drew from the family scenario. In God's intention, we see that the judge or king has a people group to govern. This people group, God's people of Israel, should be in submission to this judge or king, and the judge or king will be in submission to the Lord. We know that this does not always happen, and we can look at a man like King Saul as an example of this. So Saul starts off by doing what is right, and he starts off by following the Lord. And when he follows the Lord, he manages to take this whole group of people who just came out of the judge system, where everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes, and he manages to turn this anarchical group of people into a people who are in submission to him. So this is more of a miraculous thing than I think we give him credit for. But we know that Saul also falls off the path. When Saul stops paying attention to the Lord and is stopping in his submission to God, then he's no longer able to rule the people in the same way that he was able to. He demonstrates an inability to do what is right for his people. When he takes the place, the people no longer submit to Saul. Saul then loses much of his nation to a love for King David, which he wasn't king at that point, but he eventually would be. We can also see a more clear example of this through the life of Rehoboam. So Rehoboam is the king who is the son of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 12. And here we see Rehoboam disregard godly counsel in favor of young, foolish counsel. With his rejection comes foolish mistakes, and with his foolish mistakes, the nation of Israel will be split between Israel and the south Judah. And so when Israel leaves, the king loses those he is meant to rule over, and nobody's in submission to him anymore. So we see that he messes up, and he no longer has the ability to judge over all of the Israelites. The northern Israelites are no longer submitting to him. And while he's doing what he thinks is best, it's certainly not best, and it's pretty obvious. So an applicational note that we can take from this. It's important to note that when a leader is not in submission to the Lord, the leader cannot live to the full potential or cannot lead to the full potential that God may have established for his office. This is something we can take from the story of the kings. And when we as leaders do not submit to the Lord, it is impossible to lead in the same, it is possible to lead to the potential that the Lord could establish with us. And my last example is in Revelation chapter 19. And then if you want to turn to Revelation 19, you can too. I'm just going to start with verse 9, and I'm not going to read all of it. And the angel said to me, "Write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb." And he said to me, "These are the true words of God." And then I fell down at his feet to worship him. But he said to me, "You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy." Then I saw him, verse 11, then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, the one sitting on it called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes his war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh, he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So it's finally here in the book of Revelation in which we see the perfect example of a leader who stays true to what is right to the Lord. Now it's here where we see God as a ruler over his creation. God defeats Satan here and has previously defeated sin on the cross. And so his church glorified is no longer capable of the sin with which he has fought against ever since they became new creations. And again, God has full authority over his earthly realm as we see at the beginning of the Genesis account. So we can compare Jesus' reign to the conclusions that we made from God's reign in Genesis 1. Number 1, Jesus will rule over his church and every other creature in heaven and on earth. Number 2, we will all be in submission to him. And number 3, Jesus will rule wisely, justly, and perfectly for all of kingdom come. Now it's interesting to note that in Revelation 19, we not only see creation restored to its rightful master, but the family structure is completed in the wedding between the bridegroom and his wife, the church, between Jesus Christ and the church. We then see the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the perfect King and the perfect Judge, fulfill the kingship that we have never seen perfected. And Jesus is the only perfectly just King and Judge. We as believers will be in submission to Christ as both our perfect groom and as our Judge and our King.
So, my presentation is titled "The Place for Pre-Perfect Morality." Whether good or bad, what has marked the church for centuries is the expectation to live up to a certain standard of morality. Ever since the early church, the Catholic Church emphasized good behavior, and even today we still see that within the church, where the church heavily emphasizes good moral conduct. Now, while that's still there, a lot of people today have also begin to diminish the importance of good moral behavior, and we see comments such as, "Don't judge me just because my sin is different than your sin." And overall, we see a lot of people kind of being a little bit relaxed on the importance of good moral behavior. So how does the church respond to such a mindset that is prevalent in both the world and in the church? And as a reaction to this societal trend, some churches have compromised the truth and caved into this idea that it's more important to love people than to evaluate or to judge people because of their sin. The underlying premise here is that the evaluation of immoral living is unloving. So then the church has two objectives that they must accomplish. The first one is to give an appropriate purpose for moral living on earth. The second one is to prescribe a loving method to evaluate immoral living. So to start, we're going to look at the purpose for moral living. Now, there are two common biblical responses and reasons that people bring for good moral living. The first one is that God will judge sinners. And this one is often given to unbelievers, where people will say, the reason sin is bad is because God will judge you of your sin. The second reason that people often give for good moral behavior on earth is that sin has natural consequences that we should avoid. And this one is often given to believers, so that now that you're converted and going to heaven either way, sin has its natural consequences that you've got to avoid. Now, while these reasons are founded biblically, and they do have truth, they don't come from a biblical theology looking at moral behavior. They come from spot-picking the Bible rather than studying the narrative as a whole. This is evident when we add. It is evident of this when we add the gospel to these two principles, these two responses. The gospel ends up being the biggest obstacle to both of these reasons for good moral behavior. With the gospel, the reason that the reason not to sin, but to be morally good, is invalid because the antidote for the wrath of God is not found in good moral behavior, but it's in accepting the atonement of Jesus Christ. And it proceeds from Jesus. It's not from our own works. By doing so, we receive the righteousness of God, and enter into heaven based on his righteousness and his goodness rather than our own. And once that is accepted, moral living is no longer necessary to escape the judgment of God with that reasoning alone. We see in Romans 5:9 it says, "Since therefore we have been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God." With the gospel, also, the reason that sin has natural consequences is also invalid, because the premise of that reason is that the circumstances will be unfavorable for you if you sin, if you are not morally good. And again, this also has truth to it, but by following Christ, circumstances could also be unfavorable for us. It's the reason for our living should not be based on our own circumstances, and Jesus says that. In Matthew 7:14, he says, "For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it." Furthermore, we know that in the end, after this age, in Revelation 21:4 and 5, he says, "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new." So in the end, all the bad reasons, all the consequences, all the brokenness that is a result of our sin, which are results of our sin, is undone. For those who have accepted the gospel, all things will be made new. So this also includes the trials and tribulations that come with following Christ. It's a both-and sort of thing. Well, the biblical theologian sees the true purpose for moral living by studying the narrative of the Bible. The narrative of the Bible is about God restoring people back into a proper relationship with him. Creation tells us of God's original intention for the relationship with him, and the fall tells us of man's rejection of that relationship, of the relationship that God has designed with God's parameters and his rules. Immorality consists of rejecting the relationship that God intended for them. And that goes on today. That's the brokenness. The Old Testament history proves that God remains faithful to his people. God still pursues relationship with his people, and he leads them to victory, to the promised land, and gives them a kingdom. The condition for his blessing is a proper relationship, as done by keeping his commandments. But the Old Testament also makes clear that man is too rebellious to seek God. The kingdom given to Israel ends up being corrupt, and it goes down this downward spiral, and eventually they go into exile. As history progresses, so progresses the rebellion of mankind. It becomes clear that man's sin nature is too great for them to seek a proper relationship with God, and following the commandments has not worked for them. Therefore, Jeremiah prophesies that they need a new heart. In Jeremiah 31:33, he says, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people." The arrival of Jesus and the Holy Spirit is about restoring relationship through a restored heart. Jesus offers atonement, imputing righteousness to believers, and the purpose of that is to give believers full access to God rightfully. And the Holy Spirit is poured out and given to all people, and people are now able to worship God in spirit and in truth, and to commune with God. And the epistles urge moral living as a method to receive and enjoy that salvation that is found in the relationship with Jesus Christ. 1 John 2:3 and 5 says, "And by this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. Whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him." The purpose for moral living on earth is to receive and enjoy the substance of salvation, which is the relationship with Jesus Christ. Without the relationship, all of it becomes arbitrary and meaningless. It all finds its meaning in relationship to God. So that's the purpose that we can ascribe for pre-perfect morality. Now, what about the loving evaluation? We need to find a loving method to evaluate immoral living. And the answer to this is simple. It's forgiveness. The narrative of the Bible is that God forgave sinful people to restore relationship with him. And forgiveness doesn't discount the sin at all. Instead, it counts it and says, but my love is greater than that sin. When we see people who are living immorally, whether Christian or not, we see there are three things we must do. The first one is to recognize the immorality as broken. Whatever it is, it stands in the way of proper relationship to God. The second thing is we must offer forgiveness and grace. Ultimately, it's a Christian's responsibility to never deliver a message without good news. We must remind sinners that God values them over their sin and despite their sin, and that their sin does nothing to diminish his love for them and his desire for relationship. And finally, we must encourage them to seek the relationship with God and not simply behavior modification. By loving and exalting God, sinners are transformed and they are increasingly able to keep the commandments. Matthew 22:37-30 says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." It is by loving God, it's through love, it's through relationship that all the commandments find their context and find their meaning. And apart from relationship with God, any other reason we seek for moral living is kind of selfish. How will it impact me? Will I go to hell? What consequences will I face? At the cross of Christ, God has removed any reason for selfish morality. It's as if God poses us the question, since there's no reason for you to obey God for you, will you still do it for him? Thank you.
So I choose my topic as refugees, because we also want to consider social issues. And I ask myself what is our responsibility as Christians and how we should treat with the growing refugee problem. First, I brought you a definition according to the Geneva Convention, and I'm going to read that to you. And you can follow there perhaps a bit better. A person who is outside their country of citizenship because they have well-founded grounds for fear of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And he is unable to obtain sanctuary from their home country, or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country, or, in the case of not having a nationality and being outside the country of a former habitual residence as a result of such an event, is unable or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to their country of former habitual residence. Such a person may be called an asylum seeker, is that right pronounced? Asylum seeker, until considered with the status of refugee by the contracting state where they formally make a claim for sanctuary or right of asylum. So, the importance of the topic. Why did I choose this topic? Today, according to the UNO-Flüchtlingshilfe, are there more than 60 million refugees, and a tendency to an increasing number. As we already see on this map, are there a lot of refugees in North America, so the United States, as also as in Sweden or in Germany. So it's a problem which is a problem also for us. And the consequences for me is not the question if we want to deal with that problem, it's more the question how we should treat the refugees. So I don't want to discuss now the pros and cons of giving the refugees the possibility to live in our countries. I want to try to consider that in the biblical historical context. And I tried to do it like Graham Goldsworthy do that in his book. and I want to start with the gospel as the starting point first. Then second, I want to select a few keywords and themes which I investigated. And third, I want to investigate the whole strata of the biblical theology. So, the gospel as the starting point. As we see first, Jesus himself was a refugee. I mentioned the passages or the references right behind there, if you're interested in that. Jesus came for the whole world. Don Richardson says to that, or quote the hypothesis, that Jesus was a man for all people. He says that based on 3 passages. The first one is the Roman centurion in Matthew 8, 5 through 13. There, Jesus exploited the occasion to teach his disciples that Gentiles have just as great potential for faith as Jews, and they make just as valid objectives for grace of God too. The consequence of that is that the intimations of the Great Commission to follow could hardly have been clearer. Then secondly, the Canaanite woman, out of Matthew 15:2. Don Richardson is the opinion that Jesus' words, "Woman, you have great faith," show what he intended to do all along. Immediately preceding this event, Jesus had taught his disciples about the difference between real versus figurative uncleanness. And then thirdly, he points out the passage of the Samaritan village in Luke 9. There he quotes the verse or a specific passage and says then, "The Son of Man did not come to destroy man's life, but to save them." He understands that with those words, Jesus identified himself already as a savior for Samaritans. That was the hypothesis from Don Richardson. And thirdly, we can see that Jesus emphasizes the importance of treating foreigners well. We see that in Matthew 25, and I'm coming back to that point a bit later. Then secondly, the selection of the keywords and the themes which I tried to investigate. I researched the words refugee, refugees, foreign, foreigner, heaths, pagans, and adulterer. I researched those Bible verses and tried to do that with the help of a concordance. I choose those words like pagans or adulterers or heaths because of a saying out of it's like a flyer of the Lebensseller Mission. It's like a mission really near to myself, and they give out that flyer to give like an opinion how we could do that to treat with that problem. And for example, one word I considered like the pagans, and on my research I found out that the word pagans was mostly only used to warn before mixed marriages, so not to mix with pagan religion. So it was not a focus on an ethnical background, more on a religious background. The flyer, as I already mentioned, says that in the Old Testament we don't have an unified view on how to treat foreigners. They say that we found in the Old Testament 2 different meanings. The first meaning is that we see foreigners more like enemies, heaths, or pagans, or adulterer. There are a few passages for that. Or secondly, we see foreigner more like a foreigner, a fellow compound, who is living near to us, and this is used to emphasize the protection of God to those people. Then thirdly, the investigation of the strata of the biblical theology. I did it like Crane Goldsworthy and started with Adam and Eve. We see that Adam and Eve had to leave the Eden. That's already the origin of the rootlessness. Then we see how Cain has to leave his family and how God scattered the people who tried to build the Tower of Babel. There we see it more like in a context of punishment. Then the patriarchs. God demands of Abraham to leave his own country. We see how Jacob has to flee before his brothers. We also see how Joseph is sold as a slave and has to be a foreigner in Egypt and is treated really bad. We see how Moses had to flee, and we see how Israel flees with Moses before the Pharaoh, and how Israel has to spend 40 years in the desert. Finally, we see here also Ruth, who was a refugee because of poverty. Then if we continue to consider the Old Testament, we see in the Canaan monarchy the figure of David, who has to flee several times before Saul, and who also searches political asylum. And we see that also this topic has a really big influence of the prophets and in the prophecy, and also of Israel again at itself, like that they were departed. So, in consequence of all those passages, we see that there is a really high relevance of this feeling and experience to be a refugee for the people of Israel. And I think we can also conclude that for us today in general, there's no importance of the first negative connotation that we have to see the refugees as foreigners, as enemies, as pagans. Because those people are coming to us to see or to search for asylum, for a safe place. And if we combine that also with the definition, which I named before at the beginning for refugees. So I think we could conclude with Leviticus 19:33 till 34. And if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Then to continue with the New Testament, we see in John already that we're in this world, but not from this world. So we are also a kind of foreigners, like Israel was. We see that this thought is emphasized again in the epistles. We see that in Ephesians, and we also see this in Hebrews. In 1 Peter, we see that through the persecution of the first church, the Christians in those times are scattered, and Peter addresses his epistle to the Christians. So also the first Christians were already foreigners and lived not in their country, partly. Then we see how the thought of John is already emphasized in Revelation 2. So we could conclude out of all of that God's commandments and Jesus' word show us how we should treat refugees as our neighbors, and so equally as we treat us, and even as we would treat Jesus. And the king will answer and say to them, Assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did to one of the least of those, my brethren, you did to me. Matthew 25:40. That was the thought I already mentioned at the beginning. Secondly, we can also see we are foreigners in this world, and we should also behave like that. In addition to all that, we shouldn't forget about the importance of the Great Commission in Mark 16. A lot of people think that this coming of the refugees is a wonderful possibility for us to evangelize those persons who never heard before of this message, or to persons who were totally reserved about this and have now changed their thoughts because of their experiences. Finally, we shouldn't forget that a lot of those refugees are our sisters in faith, and that they already suffered also for us, according to Hebrews 13:3. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. Thank you.